I
Yeah.
remember in my early 20s, I was in a
Mhm.
relationship, and I remember having this thought one day, and I think it stuck with me because I don't know where it originated and I don't know why I even had it, but I remember thinking like, gosh, I bet he would rather be doing so many other things right now than hanging out with me. Welcome to the Scarlet Edit. I am your host, Nikki Corbett. When I found Dr. Zoe Shaw on Podmatch, I knew instantly that I needed her to be a guest on my show. Her energy is warm and inviting, she makes you feel comfortable right off the bat, and is a wealth of wisdom and insight. As a psychotherapist specializing in complex shame, she was able to articulate how shame works in all types of relationships, infidelity in particular. She even jogged a memory in me, something that I hadn't thought about in years. If you're dealing with any type of shame or curious about shame and guilt, this is the episode for you. Let's get into it.
Let's
Dr.
go.
Zoe, welcome to the Scarlet Edit. I am so excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, you're welcome, Nikki. And I love that title, The Scarlet Edit. Wow, that's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy that that's the response that it's getting. The more people
Mhm.
I talk to, I hear that response and it really just thrills me. So thank you so much.
Yeah, we hear so much about the Scarlet Letter, and to edit
We
it,
do.
I just,
Mhm.
wow, love it, love it.
Thanks. So I know when we first connected, we started talking
Mhm.
about our individual journeys, and you were sharing with me the work that you do. And it resonated with me so much because you immediately said the word shame. And I was like, yes, let's jump in and talk about that. So, why don't
Yeah.
you share a little background about how you got to where you are?
Yeah, great question. And that's important because it's hard to hear from somebody unless you really understand their journey and where they came from. So I'm going to give you like a very quick snapshot of my history and how I developed
Perfect.
complex shame. I grew up a little Black girl in an all white farming community. And in that process, starting when I was age 8, I, I began to develop some racial identity shame. And in my book, I talk about all the different
Hmm.
types of shame. But I was also raised in a fundamental Christian home. My dad was a prominent doctor in the community, and I got pregnant when I was 15.
Oh,
And
wow.
when my parents found out, that very much was not something that they were going to allow to continue in our home. And so
Hmm.
they sent me away to a pregnancy home for women a few hours away from where I grew up in Virginia with the understanding that I would come back without a baby. And I was a very compliant child. I had already developed a lot of codependency by that time. And I did exactly what was asked of me. I gave birth unmedicated in Virginia. I
Yeah.
left my baby in a hospital and I came back home to pretend like nothing had ever happened. And in that
Wow.
process, I developed a lot of shame. And my shame just went underground because I was holding this secret and I was holding this guilt and this shame and this grief and all of those kinds of things. I had no language for what I was experiencing. But over time, I covered a lot of my shame with accomplishments. And so I
Yeah.
achieved very highly academically. I achieved athletically, got a scholarship to UCLA. Got my bachelor's degree, got my master's degree, got my doctorate degree, began practicing, and was really just running from my shame. I got married very early because that's one of the things that sometimes happens in,
Hmm.
fundamental Christian families because you can have now legal sex and you don't have that shame of the purity culture, which was so heavy, when I was growing up. But I had a very dysfunctional marriage for a whole lot of years. I was in a 30-year relationship before I got out of that relationship. But in the process, of having my 4 or 5 children, I had a daughter who was my first kept daughter. And when she was
Hmm.
born with a very rare genetic disorder. And I had a belief at that time that God was punishing me for giving up my first daughter. That was kind of my
Mhm.
shame spiral. And so I had to learn to heal myself from my shame, even in the process that I was helping my clients heal themselves from their shame. And I began to really try to understand both myself and others. And that's how I developed the concept of complex shame, because as I looked at myself and I looked at my clients and I realized that this was a type of shame that isn't easily healed by vulnerability and external compassion. This is a different
Mhm.
type, and I labeled it complex shame. So that's kind of my journey of
Wow.
experiencing healing from shame.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I feel like we could sit and have a whole hour-long conversation about just part 1 of that journey. Kudos to you for being able to accomplish all that you have while not really even naming what you were carrying until you actually started working with people on your own and then realizing the difference between the 2 different types of shame. So explain to me where you came up with complex, because I think that is such a perfect description, especially for a journey like yours.
Right. And first, I want to say that I'm not unique in that way. Many women are carrying a burden that they don't have a name
Mhm.
for, right? And then also, on top of that, um, we experience this type of shame. We don't have a word for it, and then we continue to harm ourselves, right? But also, I want to say that complex shame, although you listen to my story and you think, oh my goodness, that's like a really hefty, heavy story. My story is not that severe. And you don't have to have a story as severe as mine to also have complex shame. So I will answer your question. The difference
Yeah.
between regular shame and complex shame, and what I call regular shame is simple shame. But first, before we can even go there, we need to talk about what's the difference between shame and guilt. Because guilt is when it's valid, because women especially do tend to have guilt that's not valid. But when guilt is valid, it's a healthy emotion that just
Mhm.
says, I have broken my moral code. I have done something that I morally believe to be wrong, and I have a feeling about that. That's guilt.
Mhm.
And guilt is a
Mhm.
healthy emotion because guilt incites healthy behavior. So if you experience guilt because you've broken your moral code, then there's something you can do about it. You can go back and you can apologize. You can attempt to repair. Sometimes we can't repair the things that we do, but what we can do after attempting to repair is we can make a choice that we will no longer do that anymore. We will change our behavior and do differently in the future. And so that's why guilt is a healthy behavior. Shame, or I should say a healthy emotional state. Shame tells us we are wrong. Shame is attached to our identity. It's not about something we've done. Sometimes it's about it, but it becomes who we are. And when
Okay.
we feel I am unworthy, I am wrong, I am no good, there's nothing for us to do if that's who we are. And so what we do
Mm.
with that is hide. So shame makes us hide. Shame in all of its form is unhealthy. So let's talk about the difference between simple shame and complex shame. So Brene
Yeah.
Brown famously began to really talk about shame and the way that shame can be alleviated in our lives. And what she explained was that when you have shame, when you talk about it, when you're vulnerable and you receive this external compassion from people, all of a sudden your shame goes away. That's why the Me Too movement existed. All of the things externally, when we're able to talk about them and somebody else says, me too, or somebody else says, that's okay, or somebody else says, I understand, most shame, when it's simple shame, does get alleviated. You feel better. It goes away. But
Mhm.
there's a different type of shame, and I call it complex shame. And that type of shame, when you experience, well, when you choose to be vulnerable, two things happen. Either when someone gives you external compassion, there's a part inside of you that's like, you don't understand. Oh no, if you really knew, you would not be giving me this compassion. And so you're not able to take it in. And that's because shame has become so wound with your identity. And usually what happens with shame is that when we are harmed or when we do something, we feel shame about it, then we tend to harm ourselves. And it just gets so interwoven, we cannot separate it. And so we're not able to take in that external compassion. The other thing that can happen, and this happens a lot with marginalized people in our society, is that when we talk about our shame, we're then gaslit and we're told, that didn't
Yeah.
happen. You didn't see it right. I don't think you really understand. And so we're made to feel like our experience didn't even really happen or exist. And so our shame just goes. And so that shame, complex shame, is not alleviated by the external compassion. And so we have to do some other things to untangle it. That's how I came to the understanding of the difference.
Okay. Okay, so I want to go back to when you first were explaining guilt versus shame, because it made me think about, you hear parents say to like little kids, "Oh, you should be ashamed of yourself." And it
Yes.
makes me wonder, instead of saying that, should the response actually be, you should feel guilty for doing that? Because if you hit another kid, or if you take your sister's toy and the other kid's crying, I can remember being told as a kid, like, oh, you should be ashamed of yourself
Yep.
for that behavior. But it was the behavior in the moment. It wasn't like I should be ashamed or of myself for like something that I inherently am. So that intrigued
Yes. So
me.
I'll absolutely answer that question. We as a society use shame to control, and it
Mm,
looks like it works. So this happens in, Christian churches. It's
mm,
very rampant in faith communities. It happens in our society as a whole. We use shame to control. But research has shown that although it looks like when you shame somebody, their behavior changes, it actually doesn't. Instead, their behavior goes underground. They hide. They do things in secret. It does not change behavior. And so one of the worst things we can do as parents is shame our children, is tell them you should be ashamed. You are anything globally that is not healthy or good, right? Instead, I would question the behavior. Does that behavior feel like the right thing to do? Does that behavior feel kind to you? Does that behavior feel loving? When you ask them that question, then you get them to begin to develop their own moral compass, and they can think, that behavior doesn't feel that way. I don't think I will do that. As opposed to, you should be ashamed, because then it's like, oh, I'm bad. And there isn't a desire to change. There's just a desire to hide the badness. If that
mhm.
makes sense. And
No, it
so,
totally
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
Okay. Okay. So then now going further to the shame versus complex shame. So the way you described it, it makes perfect sense to me because, especially with the whole vulnerability edition, anytime you share something that you feel badly about or you feel like isn't normal, and then you tell somebody and they say, like exactly like you said, oh my gosh, me too, or oh, like I can totally relate, or oh my god, that happened to me, then you're immediately, it's like this weight has been lifted and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. Like, that's
hmm
insane. That's crazy. I had no idea. And that's truly one of the reasons why I started this podcast, is because I know that in all types of relationships, there can be stigma, there can be shame, there can be things that people carry as they leave different relationships for whatever those reasons may be. And especially
right.
when you go down, maybe like how I kicked off this podcast, maybe you were the other woman, maybe you cheated on your spouse. Maybe you've been divorced multiple times. Maybe you've had failed engagements. And I hate even using the word failed. Maybe you've had engagements that have ended.
Good,
And
yeah.
then you're carrying that with you. And I want people to feel comfortable releasing that shame. I want people to feel like they can still go after the life that they want. I feel that we all deserve to be loved and to have that love that we want in our lives. So, again, this just spoke to me so much when you started talking about this. So the complex piece of it, though, I think that is so much deeper. And I would love to continue to elaborate on that with you.
Yeah. First of all, there's a couple of things when it comes to complex shame. Number one, people who tend to have complex shame tend to also be codependent in relationships. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why. People with complex shame tend to be internalizers. People with what we talk about toxic shame tend to be externalizers, where they kind of project and spew their shame and toxicity outward on other people. People with complex shame tend to be internalizers, and that's like a temperament, meaning that they tend to take things on. They tend to take blame on. It must be my fault. I should be able to fix it. It's two sides to a coin, because when you feel like everything's your fault and you must be able to fix it, you tend to also be very strong externally in other relationships and or in your life, because you are kind of a take control. I'm going to be able to tackle this, but it sabotages you in relationships sometimes, because you take on all the emotional burden of maintaining the relationship, of controlling your partner's emotional state, of tiptoeing around them so that they will be happy, right? And so that's the other aspect of complex shame. When you internalize everything and take the blame, then you're also taking on all the responsibility for a relationship that you shouldn't be. And you're keeping your partner from being able to really step up. The other thing when it comes to complex shame is that when we feel so much shame about ourselves, remember shame makes us hide. And so when we show up in relationships, we tend to hide those parts of ourselves that we feel are not worthy or loving or lovable, I should say. And so when we show up in a relationship and we're hiding, when our partner actually loves us, we don't feel loved because there's a part of us that feels like if they really knew me, they wouldn't love me. And so then you're responding to your partner who may be loving you in a way as if they don't love you. And it becomes this unhealthy cycle of you never being able to be in a relationship where you are fully known and seen and loved. And it
Oh,
creates just that same codependency of trying to control the other's emotions, kind of hustling, right, for your worthiness. So that's kind of what codependency and complex shame do.
yeah. I mean, I feel like you're just like preaching so much amazing information right now. I'm just sitting here just like soaking it all in. I hope everybody who's listening is too, because I feel like so much of this is so relatable.
Yeah. And it drives both you as a person possibly being the one that betrays in your relationship and also you being the betrayed. It drives both sides because when you don't feel
Mhm.
loved in a relationship, when you don't feel seen, then you have this drive to try to get that outside of the relationship without recognizing that you are actually kind of a part of this whole codependent soup, if you will. And so it can
Mhm.
drive you to try to get that validation and acceptance outside. It doesn't really work. I mean, it might feel great, but it doesn't really work because once again, you're probably hiding in that relationship too. And then it also drives infidelity on your partner's part because like I said, when you're responding to them as if you're not loved, they're just creates this distance because in when shame makes us hide, it also distances us in our relationships. And I'm not blaming anybody for the betrayal that happened to you, right? We
Of course.
choose people for reasons that we aren't always aware of. We choose familiarity, we confuse familiarity with, attraction, love, all these kinds of things. And yes, we are always a part of whatever happens in our dynamic, but it is never, your fault if someone betrays you. But I think it's always important in any relationship that isn't going well for you to figure out what am I doing and how am I contributing to this? What am I accepting that maybe I should not be accepting? What have I been accepting? How do I need to stand up and put in healthy boundaries? How do I need to work on healing myself?
I think the self-reflection part is so
Mhm.
important, and I think, unfortunately, sometimes people skip that step, and then they move on to the next instead of taking that step back and kinda going, "Okay, I am the common denominator in each of these relationships that I've been in, and what are some of the similarities, and what are some of the things that I've done over and over again?" I mean, I know personally after my last relationship, like, I really did have that, like, hard come to Jesus moment with myself where I was like,
Mhm.
"Okay, what's similar about these people or these men that I have had these long-term relationships with?" And, sometimes, the results aren't that pretty and,
Yeah.
and it doesn't make you feel that great, but I think acknowledging it is the only way to actually move forward and be able to find something that does work for you. If that's what you ultimately really want. And I'm still
Yeah.
working on that. I'm still working on that next step, so
We all are. We all are. I wrote an article about I think it was the three things I learned about codependency from my divorce. And Nikki, nobody wants to do this work. It doesn't
Yeah,
feel good. It feels so much better to just hop into another relationship where you can distract yourself for another few months until all the stuff pops up again, right? And then just
yes.
wash, rinse, repeat, whatever. It's not easy work, but it is the most valuable work that you could do ever. And it does take learning about your what I call phantom critic. And our phantom critic comes from often so long ago. It's these messages we heard in childhood or early relationships that we pack up with us. Even when we leave a relationship, we pack up all those words, and the phantom critic just is like, I'll take that role now. And it repeats the words back to us. We need to understand what those messages are that we play out in these relationships, where they came from, and how we can begin to
Yeah.
untangle them, and then also untangle our own blame and learn to forgive ourselves.
This week's episode is brought to you by my Patreon community, Rewritten. Inside this space, you will find resources, live Q&As, opportunities to connect with others in the privacy of a judgment-free zone, and so much more. I want to build this community together, a society of women who are choosing the best for ourselves, who are shaking off the stigma or shame of past decisions and using our history to shape our futures. Come check out the Patreon. Anyone who signs up between now and October 31st, the first month, is free. I look forward to seeing you inside. Now back to our episode. Yeah, this is like a very raw thing I'm about to share. But I
Mhm.
think that it goes well into this part of the conversation that we're having. And since I've been an open book on this podcast up till now, I figure why not? But I
Yeah.
remember in my early 20s, I was in a
Mhm.
relationship, and I remember having this thought one day, and I think it stuck with me because I don't know where it originated, and I don't know why I even had it, but I remember thinking like, gosh, I bet he would rather be doing so many other things right now than hanging out with me. And it was like
Wow.
almost like in that moment, I felt bad for him that he was hanging out with me instead of doing something else or hanging out with somebody else. And I have no idea where that came from. And it's such a sad thought. Like, who would want to think that? Why did I think that? Why did I think I wasn't like great enough to be spending time with or to be in a relationship with? I don't know. So that just kind of jumped in my head as you were talking about all of that.
That's the phantom critic. And my question to you would be, when did you feel that before? Because
Yeah.
here's the thing, the messages we get that are the strongest in our childhood often are never verbally spoken to us. We hear them loud and clear. Our
Mhm.
parent may never say, I'd rather be doing something else than spending time with you, right? Well, I mean, some parents might, but most parents, good, loving
Yeah.
parents, would never say that. But sometimes we get those messages loud and clear. And so I wonder where in your life, prior to this relationship, you received
Yeah.
that message that this person doesn't really want to be with me.
Yeah. I do too. I mean, again, I have not thought about that in probably years, and it for some reason jumped into
Mhm.
my head as you were speaking. So,
Mm.
yeah, but I mean, it's weird thinking about these like little moments that stick with us as we go through life and age, and some of them we just remember over and over, and then some
Yeah,
jump into our minds at the most. I imagine it's not a coincidence that I just thought of that right now. It's because
right.
you're
Yeah.
stirring something up with all of your wisdom. But yeah, it is crazy the things that I think subconsciously that we pick up on and that become a part of our behavior, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, and that was a perfect example that you just gave, because when you're sitting with him and he's probably enjoying his time with you and you're thinking, he doesn't even want to be with me, you're responding to him as if he doesn't want to be with you. And so you
Right,
may be
right.
micro rejecting him or responding to him in certain ways that he will experience as off and not know. And then maybe he creates his own meaning for why you're showing up
Right.
that way, and that's how we get that disconnection in our relationships. And it comes from
Mhm.
shame. It comes from shame.
Yeah. So, what what advice do you give? How do you help coach your clients through working through this so they can get, can you completely let go of this complex shame? Can you get on the other side of it?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I wrote my book. That's why I do my podcast. I've developed an 8 step, it's really 9 steps when you include maintenance, um, steps for overcoming complex shame. And it starts with going
Okay.
back to those stories, that story that just triggered yourself, in your mind, going back to understanding what are those stories the phantom critic is telling me. Start to label them, understand what type of shame you have, because there's a number of different types of shame. There's like racial identity shame, there's religious shame, there's body shame, there's gender shame, there's imposter syndrome shame. There's so many different types of shame. So understanding what type of shame you have, and then working on untangling the blame. And this one is hard because whether we contributed to our shame or somebody else victimized us in some way, shape, or form, what we often do is blame, especially when you have complex shame. And so even if you had zero blame for a situation, there's a part of your brain that thinks, oh, but I could have, let's say you were attacked or something, I could have pepper sprayed them, or I could have fought back. Or I've even heard people say, if I hadn't fought back, it wouldn't have been so bad. It's like, no matter what,
Wow.
your brain does this bargaining, right?
Hmm.
And so what we have to do is understand, what do we blame ourselves for? And this is where a lot of therapists will just try to get you to take the blame away and just say, it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known. All of these things to absolve you, which sound good, but actually doesn't work with the way our brain works. Because what we actually have to do is say, okay, let's talk about what you blame yourself for. What could you have done differently? What
Yeah.
what do you wish you had, right? And it feels like victim blaming when we say, let's talk about what you could have done to prevent this. But it's the way our brain works. And so we've got to go ahead and take accountability for that. And then once we've taken accountability, we've got to work on forgiving ourselves.
Yeah.
And when I talk about self-forgiveness, my favorite quote about forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. And I love that
Mm.
quote because it's not attached to anybody. It's not attached to me. It's not attached to anybody who may have done something to me. I am simply giving up all hope that my past could have been different. And when
Yeah.
I understand, number one, that all behavior makes sense in its context, everybody's behavior in the world does make sense. And I've also given up all hope of a better past, then I can move towards acceptance, right? And once we have that sense of acceptance, then we can begin to do that thing that we do with simple shame, is become vulnerable, talk about it
Got
to
it.
people who are
Okay.
healthy. And then two things. Because we've already absolved ourselves, if someone gives us external compassion, guess what? We can accept it. And
Mm.
then if they don't, we've already given it to ourselves. And so we don't need it from anybody anymore. And so that's how we're able to begin to
Yeah.
untangle it and heal from it. And then there's maintenance, because the reality is that shame will never go away in society, right? Shame
Right.
is a social construct. It will always show up. Shame shows up for me on a regular basis. But what I do now is when shame shows up, I like watch it like it's just rolling by in a river and I'm standing at the river and I say, "Oh, that's shame. I'm going to let it
Yeah.
go by and I'm not going to do what shame wants me to do, which is to hide. Instead, I'm going to speak up." Right. And
Mm.
when I
Mm.
work on shame from my body, when I work on doing the opposite thing that shame wants me to do, then I'm in a place of maintenance. Shame is no longer sabotaging or ruling or controlling my life.
Okay. So yeah, it's taking the control back
Mhm,
over it,
mhm.
right? I mean, one of the things that I
Right.
was thinking about as you were talking about that was people that use food for their feeling and for their
Mhm,
feelings and
mhm.
thinking about how you get stressed out or you get sad or you get frustrated and you go to the refrigerator or the pantry, and in that case, it would be like, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to allow this to have
Yes.
power over me.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into the refrigerator and eat or do whatever because I'm not hungry. And I know that this is just something that's part of how I was wired, but I'm no longer wired that way.
Right. And so what am I going to do that's healthy instead? Yes, that's
Yeah.
the next too. Yeah.
Yeah. So in your work,
Mhm.
have you had people who have had infidelity in their lives? Is that more like regular shame or complex shame that you have seen? Or is it just so individual every time with every human being, regardless of the journey?
Yeah. So the answer is yes, yes, yes. And my over 2 decades of working with people, I have seen the other woman, I have seen, the person who's unfaithful, I have seen the one who's been betrayed, all of it, and their family
Yeah.
members and children and all of the things. And it is not a one size fits all, because infidelity shows up in so many different ways in a relationship. It can be a, one time infraction. And usually that's going to be a simple type of shame. If someone can, talk about it and they can work it out in a marriage and it can be absolved. There can be reasons why, someone has complex shame. And that's one of the reasons why they are seeking, attention, seeking relationships outside of their marriage or their main relationship. Um, there could be complex shame and or simple shame that exists in a marriage. So it's not a one size fits all. It depends. But what I can promise you is that shame is in existence in all types of infidelity. Wherever you land, shame exists there. It may be simple
Mhm.
shame, may be complex shame, and that's for you to figure out and understand. But it's definitely a part of any kind of betrayal and infidelity on both sides.
Do you feel like from the complex shame aspect, when you are dealing with people, is it easier for you to recognize the difference now that you identified it within yourself and then created this name for it?
Yes, yeah, it's a lot easier for me to identify it now. When people show up in my office and they quickly are able to kind of be vulnerable and talk about it. It's usually probably more about simple shame. When it takes a long time for them to kind of connect and identify and be able to talk about the things for which they feel shame, it tends to be more complex shame. And then also just hearing the stories and hearing the words that people are saying to themselves, because I'm always mining for your internal dialogue so that I can
Oh, yeah.
understand you better. And that internal
Mhm.
dialogue tells us so much.
Yeah. Well, certainly because like you were saying, the shame aspect or when people are shaming you, it's basically like they're saying you're bad. So that would resurface in self-talk. And so I
Yeah.
can see why that is so important and such a great skill to have in doing what you do to understand, how are people speaking to themselves cuz I mean, I know for my own self, negative self talk was a big hurdle that I had to work through. And I mean, I had got to a point where I had some negative self talk that was so automatic. It was so just I didn't even realize that it was happening because it was just so
Right.
part of who I was, and getting to a point where I finally recognized, like, "Whoa, why are these things coming out of your mouth so easily when you're talking to yourself, about yourself?"
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
getting to the point where I could of officially stop that and no longer do that, because, yeah, I mean, so many of us don't know that's even happening.
Right. And, I can almost guarantee you if you are the other woman in a relationship and you are continuing to agree to be the other woman in your relationship, then the lack of worth that you are experiencing is directly connected to complex shame. Because there's a
That's
part of you that
interesting.
does not feel that you're worthy of
Uh-huh.
having a full relationship with this person. You're allowed
Yeah.
because if you felt that sense of worth, you would not stay in that situation. And so,
Yeah.
for a woman out there who is the other woman or has been the other woman, pay attention to what you feel you deserve. And it's directly attached to your shame and your sense of self worth.
Mhm. It's so interesting because obviously, like, that was me. So as I'm
Mhm.
listening to all this, I'm like reflecting on my own journey. And then going back to what you brought up when you brought up guilt and the guilt and the shame piece, because I never felt guilty. I didn't feel I just didn't. I never felt guilty by the
Mhm.
true definition. And I
Right.
don't and I don't feel like I lack morals. I don't feel
Right.
like I'm not a good person.
Mhm.
So that's an interesting, kind of struggle though when you hear the way you described guilt. I was thinking like, "Oh shit, like I didn't feel guilty." So like what does that say about me, when I do hold myself in high regard and I do think all of these things. But then when you just said what you said about the lack of self-worth, because if you had that, you wouldn't be here, or you wouldn't stay here. And I think that that is what so many women struggle with when they are in these types of
Yeah.
relationships. And then especially when you
Mhm.
add being in love on top of it
Yes.
and all of the
Mhm.
emotions that come along with that, it's like this constant like weighing game, or these checks and balances where it's like, well, this is everything is really great, but and then it goes, and then finally you get to that point where it's so wildly out of balance on the other side that that's when it's like, okay, I deserve more than this and it's time for me to go.
Yes. What you described is the fantasy of limerence, right?
Yes.
When we are in limerence, we have that fantasy of what could be. We see all of the potential of our partner, all of the potential of the relationship. And that limerence is such a strong physiological, chemical drive that it keeps us from being able to see the glaring red flags, or we might see them, but we just put on blinders, right? Because we've convinced
Yeah.
ourselves that this is still going to work out, or I see the potential. And especially with those strong women that I talked about, these internalizers, there's this sense of, I can make this work. Like if I hustle harder, if I show up better, if I'm, whatever it is, I can make this work. And so we get stuck in in this place of, I'm going to prove my worthiness so that he will finally choose me. And the
Yeah.
reality is that you are already worthy, and you don't have to hustle for him to choose you, right? You are already worthy, and he is not going to, because you are showing up and allowing, you're co-signing to all of this that's happening. And
Totally.
so what happens over time is, as the limerence kind of goes away, the blinders come off a little bit. Some women will still stay stuck because their self-worth is so low, because of the
Yeah.
sunk cost fallacy that you've put in so much time, and this still, this fantasy that still exists. But often, eventually, it's hard to not see all of the glaring red flags, and most women over time will stop. But then when we do, there's more damage. We've done all of this extra damage to our self-worth, and it takes a lot to just repair and fix and get to a place where we do feel worthy. Because in ending the relationship, women often are ending the relationship at a point when they actually are feeling their lowest, but there's
Mm.
nothing left to do. And so for women who are in that situation, honor that. Like, honor where you are right now, honor the grief, honor the process that you're going to need to get to a place of healing. But that place of healing, it's possible. It's more than possible if you put in the time and the energy. And when you do, you are going to up level, not just you, but you are going to up level what you expect in a relationship, what you attract, and what you end up having.
Absolutely. I mean, I am living proof of that. I promise you that. Like
Well,
the
yeah.
bar has been raised so exponentially, and I thought it was high to begin
Mhm.
with, and now I'm just like it makes me
Right.
laugh, honestly, but in a good
Mhm.
way. But gosh, everything that you're saying is just it's so true. It's like you live in this fantasy that if I do more, if I show up better, if I love him harder, if I love him more, if I do this, if I prove that I can be XYZ, all of the things that, he'll finally 100% choose me. And then you get on the other side and in retrospect, it's like, well, of course he was never going to leave. Like I was giving him everything. He was having his cake and eating
Right.
it too. And I mean,
Yes.
that saying
Yes.
is a saying for a reason, And it's like,
Yeah.
and then I've had other conversations on this podcast where talking about infidelity and how sometimes an affair can bring out the best in the person
Mhm.
who is having it because they're getting all of their needs met now. So they can go home and they're in a
Right.
good mood because they're not stressed out. Like he's not stressed out that he's not going to get laid tonight because he already did. So he can go home and he can be focused. He
Mhm.
can be a great dad and he can do all these things, or a great mom, whatever it may be. And so then it's like they're showing up better. So it's like, in their minds, they're like, well, hey, best of both worlds is pretty great. But for the person that's the only thing they have, it's it it's lonely and it can suck.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, and
Right.
like I already said, you get to a point where the bad outweighs the good. And then it's like you kind of break free. I had a friend one time describe it wasn't an infidelity situation, but he had got divorced after being married for many years. And he's like, I feel like, remember that scene in Alice in Wonderland where it goes from black and white to color? And he's like, I think I
Yes.
was
Yes.
just so, just
Yep.
so content, or not content, but he was like, I was just so like just going through the motions for so long that I didn't even
Mhm.
realize. He's like, and
Ugh.
now life is so colorful and different.
Yeah. Yeah. You become desensitized to the, just health in your environment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I mean, I truly feel like this was just like a therapy session for me. I learned so much and I have so much to think about now.
Oh,
Um,
good. Good.
but for people who are listening and who are, really understood what you meant by the difference between simple shame and complex shame, because I think this is incredibly important. And as they're, wrapping the show up with us and they're
Mhm.
thinking about to themselves, like, okay, how do I determine where I am at with my life journey? What type of, or what kind of advice can you give them if they want to really start digging into this?
Yeah, well, first of all, you can find shame in your life anywhere that you hide. That's where shame exists. So anytime you start to feel, I don't want people to know that, I want to make sure I'm
Mm.
keeping this a secret or hiding this. Anything that you want to make sure that you are hiding in your life, that is exactly where your shame is, and that's where you need to start digging. Understanding, why do I need to hide this? Why don't I want people to know? That type of thing. I highly suggest you get my book, because in the book I talk about the 8 steps of complex shame, of healing it, of overcoming it. I talk about my own personal story, and I share the story of many of my clients and the type of shame that they experienced and how to overcome it. And so the first step I would say is start to identify the type of shame and where your shame exists. And you figure that out by figuring out where you're hiding in your life.
Okay, that was good. That was so good. Oh my gosh. I think this is one of the best parts about having a podcast is that I get to talk to all
Mhm.
these like wickedly smart people. So this was absolutely amazing, Dr. Zoe. Thank you so much for being here. Tell everybody how they can find
Thank
you and get in touch with you.
Yeah, so you can I hang out on Instagram at Dr. Zoe Shaw, DrZoeShaw, and the same on my website. You can check out my podcast, Stronger in the Difficult Places, and you can buy my book of the same name, Stronger in the Difficult Places.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And everybody who's listening,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for being here. If you loved the show, please go on Apple and rate it 5 stars. And I would love a review telling me why you're giving us such a great rating. And for everybody who is going through any sort of shame or shame spiral, please know that you are not alone and that there are resources out there to help you. So thank you again, Dr. Zoe, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you, Nikki.